Miller. I was privileged to get a copy of his book, fresh off the press, to know him, to watch him do the research. I learned a lot. I also learned that he was a very normal God. Okay, as a writer, he was amazing, but I came to respect him tremendously, but yet he was just a normal guy. I remember eating pizza in the research center at the museum, and him talking about deep sea fishing off the coast. I mean, it was so normal. But for all of you who may not know, and I'm sure most all of you know, and that's the reason why you're here, is that Donald L. Miller is the John Henry McCracken Professor of History at Lafayette College. He has hosted the series The Biography of America on PBS and several PBS shows. You'll always see his byline on a lot of stuff. The American Experience series, as well as programs on the History Channel. I mean, Lou Rita has nothing on Donald Miller, okay?
Thank you.
He's the author of 8 previous books, and that's previous to Masters of the Air, including The Prize-Winning City of the Century, The Epic of Chicago and the Making of America, The Story of World War II, and D-Days in the Pacific. This man has so many wonderful accolades. When you go and Google him, you'll be there for a while, okay? But he is one of the most normal, down-to-earth people I've ever met in my entire life, and I've met some of the most fascinating people off the pages of history ever. So it is truly, truly my privilege, my honor to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Donald Miller. Thank you.
Okay.
Sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I hate speaking at banquets. Rattling china, things like that. So I always tell my students, if anybody moves, I was a sniper in Vietnam and I still carry. So that's a joke. I want to thank the 8th Air Force Association for inviting me here, the Historical Association, Deborah, and Vivian Rogers Price, who's sitting over there with the 8th Air Force Museum, where I got this whole project started. I mean, she runs the place. She is it. She is it. And I had never written a book on World War II or even taken a course in military history before 2000. And although my dad served in the 8th Air Force, my uncle was with the Big Red One, 1st Division. First on the beaches of Normandy. He was in the first wave. My uncle flew B-50, B-29s in the Pacific. We have a military family. My grandfather fought in World War I. All of us served, and it just never occurred to me. And to write a story about the war, and until my father died. And it was too late to talk with him, and I felt guilty as hell. And I started digging in this stuff, and I thought, well, first I'll write a general history of the war so that I can learn about it by writing about it. Writers learn history by writing history. You'll never know as much history as when you write it. You dig in and work with primary documents. And then I wrote a book about the Pacific, about the Marine Corps. And then I came around and said, it's time to do the big book on the 8th Air Force. And when I Googled it, 8th Air Force, I came up with 998 titles. That's about as many missions as you guys flew. The 8th Air Force. And that was a little daunting, especially when I told my publisher at Simon & Schuster. He wasn't happy. He said, do you think anybody will buy this book? I said, yeah, well, we'll see. You tell the story right, I think it'll go. So I came to a conference like this in Norfolk, Virginia. And I didn't know a soul, absolutely not a soul. I was new to this, to 8th Air Force history. And I rented a room there, and I started to mix with the veterans. And you guys are part of the story. You're the heroes, and it's very daunting to speak before an audience of guys who flew and fought. I'm just telling their story. You guys lived it. You kicked ass, and you lived not to tell about it. You lived not to brag about it. And that's something that is truly laudable. And you helped save our country from a Nazi menace. No air power, we don't win that war in ETO. We certainly don't win it in 5 years. So I was at the conference, and I started to mix with the guys, and I met a guy called Lou Lovsky. And he's a character in my book, eventually, and he is a character. And I asked him if he knew some fellow vets who would care to come up to my room. And I sat in my room for 5 days. Guys stayed after the conference, 2 days after. And I interviewed guys 12 hours a day. I was totally absorbed in this sort of stuff. And Lou was the first interviewee. He came bounding through the door. At the time, he was 86 years old. And he said, I can do 100 push-ups. I said, well, that's great, but that's not what... Let me show you, he said. So it's a tight room, and he jumps in between the two beds, and he does 100 push-ups. And he's hardly breathless after this. I said, that's great. Now tell me your story. And it was a great story because it's a POW story. And a great part of my book is about the POWs, and a great part of the film that we're making with HBO, this 10-part series, is about the POW camps. And Lou has a poignant but very funny story. If you haven't read my book, I'll mention it briefly here. He was shot down on his first mission as a navigator. Tough kid from northern New Jersey. And he's parachuting down over the Reich. And I said, Lou, how did that feel? A Jew about to land in Nazi Germany. He said, that didn't bother me. Something else bothered me. I said, what's that? He said, well, when I came over here, he said, before I came, I bought 144 condoms. And I said, 144 condoms? I said, you were that sexually active? He said, no, I'm a virgin, but I'm very hopeful. So he stuffed them in his service uniforms, his Go to London uniform, which he left in his Nissan hut. And he knew the procedure. As soon as you're down, they strip everything and send it home. And that's all he worried about, is mom opening the case and thinking the kid's turned into a sexual nut. And but there's a great ending. Every day in camp, when they bring in new rushes of prisoners, he'd watch for guys from his bomb group. And a couple arrived, and they gave him the oath. We ditched the stuff before we sent it home. And no condoms in the footlocker. But the 8th Air Force story, to me, the thing that first fired out at you, you have to get something that really gets your heart moving, because you have to have passion to write. It's almost, it's emotional, it's almost a sexual experience, it's passion. And the first thing that just came right out at me was 26,000 killed. And as I mentioned in my book, well, the Marine Corps lost 19,800 guys in the entire Pacific War. That's from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. And this one unit in England, flying fewer than 1,000 missions, loses 26,000 men and over 30,000 prisoners of war. And that doesn't count missing in action. Harrison Salisbury, the New York Times, at the time in 1944, said to be a member of the 8th Air Force was to hold a ticket to a funeral, your own. Your chances of surviving were 1 in 3. And these are terrible odds, terrible odds. And a great part of the book and a great part of the film we're doing for HBO is about two things, really. How in the world did you guys get in those planes, knowing what you had to face? And when there were breakdowns, and when comrades, just had enough, how do you knit yourself back together again? How do you pull yourself back together again and get back in the plane and go up again? Comradeship, yes, but there's a lot more than that, because everything about the air war was new. There has never been another bomber war in history, and there never will be another bomber war in history with nuclear missiles and and everything. The whole technology's changed. World War I, there were primitive bombers. There was never a bomber war. So new planes have to be invented. New equipment has to be invented. New medicine has to be invented, because airmen broke down in different ways than Marines broke down. There's a difference between combat fatigue on the ground and what's combat fatigue in the air. And they're treated differently. Drugs are differently. Everything's different about the air war. So the air war that you guys fought was entirely experimental. And that's what made it so precarious, so doubly dangerous. No one quite knew exactly what to expect and when to expect it. And the other thing about it that interested me, and that we're trying to build into the film as well, is it's unique. Now, I don't think that it's necessarily more dangerous flying over the Reich than fighting on the beaches at Omaha. Okay? Combat on the ground is horrific. Combat in the air is equally horrific. But there are differences. There are major differences. For one thing, there's no such thing as retreat in the air. You go to the target, you muscle your way through, you drop your bombs, and you return. The only thing that brings you back otherwise is mechanical failure. Otherwise, every mission the 8th Air Force fought got through with unbelievable, abysmal casualties, okay? 60, sometimes 67, 68 planes. That's 10, 12 guys in a plane sometimes. That's rough stuff. The other thing that's different about it is an air fight. You get this, you're flying in a robin's egg blue sky, you pop through the clouds over your base, it's like a trout jumping out of water, clear skies, you fly to the Reich. You got the BBC on, the radio's on, the songs of the 40s are there, and then you hit the guns. And then the fighters peel off as 43, and you're all the way to the target, fighting for your life. In fact, in one of the scenes in the film that we just finished for, Masters of the Air, it's an hour and 20 minutes, and an hour and 10 minutes of the film takes place entirely in 2 planes. Nothing outside the planes, just 20 men fighting for their lives inside these planes on the Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission. It's grim, it's tough. This series that we're making is, it's so much more grounded in the actual realities of World War II than Band of Brothers. And our writers are largely, and our main writer is largely from Band of Brothers. And so it's a very different war. If you've seen the German film Das Boot, that's the mood that we try to establish. Men doing their jobs, trying to stay alive. That's what it's about. And one of the sad things about the war is my uncle could have, if he wanted to, return to Omaha Beach. He never did. Men go back to Bastogne. I go back with veterans to the Battle of the Bulge. I go with veterans to Guadalcanal. I was just there. You guys can't return to Schweinfurt, to Munster, to the air above it. There's nothing there. There's no monuments. An air battle took place of tremendous horror, okay? 600 German fighters at closing speeds of 600 miles an hour, fighting 800 bombers. It's like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Everything's flying around, propellers falling, men falling out of planes with parachutes, men falling out of planes with parachutes on fire, men falling out of planes without parachutes. It's like a German Luftwaffe pilot told me what it reminded him was of a gigantic ashtray in the sky filled with all this material and just dumped it. And then, 20 minutes later, it's over. It's gone. That was the Battle of Munster. And you can't go back. There's no reunions at Munster. This is why these reunions are important. The ones you have right here. This is why they're so meaningful, to hook up with your comrades at places like this. There's another thing that's unique about the air war, aside from the fact that you can't yell medic, like we could yell in Vietnam and you got somebody there, okay, or corpsman. There's no foxholes in the sky, there's no medics in the sky. You're flying in an aluminum tube filled with gasoline over the toughest anti-aircraft fire in the world. That's precarious. That's precarious beyond belief. The other thing is, there's no generals in the sky. There's colonels and things like that. But Patton can direct a battle, okay? When he sees it going badly at this part of the battlefield, he can move troops. I can go to Gettysburg. I take my students there, and I can say, Pickett was a fool for making the charge. Another person said, well, that wall that Meade fought behind on the Union Hill was pretty low, and maybe he had a chance, okay? Years and years ago, when I was just a kid, I actually had the honor of walking the field with Eisenhower. And a tremendous honor. And he went back to Gettysburg again and again. But you can't do that if you were in the Air Force. You can't. There were no generals to direct a battle in the sky. Never in the history of warfare was so much authority, so much responsibility placed in people so young. 23, 24 years old, it's the old man on the plane, maybe. Whether they get to the target, and that's a big thing, getting to the target, because the weather's bad, maybe over England, up through the soup, maybe it clears in the channel, maybe it's clear at the target at 6 in the morning, but it's bad later. Coming back, the weather looks pretty good. All of a sudden, an hour later, with that capricious English climate, it's bad again. Everything's crazy about it. Getting the bombs on the target, getting crewmen back, deciding what to do when a guy goes down in the plane, when you have no medical knowledge other than the fact that you're given a morphine vial and you can stick it in the guy and put a blanket over him and hope he survives on the freezing floor of the plane, but you still got to fly to Berlin and then take him back. Sometimes they bandage guys up and they push them out of the planes in the hope that the Germans would take care of them, and sometimes they did. So the Air War is different in that way. You don't see as many dead guys in the Air Force. They're blown to bits in the sky. When there are casualties on the base, terrible casualties, the guys are scooted away immediately to a cemetery like Cambridge. I interviewed some guys. I told the story in the book. The one guy was hitching a ride to London, and he flags down this, what looked like a panel truck, but he didn't know it was an ambulance. It didn't have any markings on it. They didn't put the markings on them. And the guy said, "Come on, we'll give you a ride." So he goes to the back. He opens up. They go, "Don't open the panels." Well, he opens the panels, and there's 6 bodies there, fish-white dead bodies. The first dead bodies he told me he'd ever seen. In combat on the ground, you see dead people all the time. Sometimes you even sit on the corpses and eat. They're frozen corpses like they did in the Battle of Bulge. You eat your K rations. It's just a lot different. So even things like common things like we breathe air to survive. We love sunshine. The air kills over 10,000 feet. It's deadly. So you got to go on oxygen. You're tethered to the plane. You're part of the technology, the war machine. You are a part of the machine. When it's clear skies, when the sun's out, that's bad news. That's good hunting for the Luftwaffe. It's cloudy, you have a little protection. So all these things kind of defy the conventions about how to tell a story too, about a different kind of combat, and tell a story in writing to a broad audience, and tell a story on television to a broad audience. Now, I want to throw up some slides here and run through some brief experiences that I find very poignant that we've tried to bring into the film, and a little bit of the history of the 8th Air Force. But several people were asking me beforehand at the cocktail hour, and I did participate. And tell us a little bit about the HBO film, where we are with that. So, and I can answer some questions on that later too. But here's the story. We are well ahead of where we thought we'd be. It takes a long time to do these things. It took 6 years to do the Pacific. I worked on that. It took 5 years to do Band of Brothers. I didn't work on that. And so I think it's going to be another 2 years. We're in the advanced scripting stage. Tom Hanks is a great guy to work for, but he's a very demanding guy. And that causes a lot of stress with the writers. For example, what he wants the writers to do, what he did in the first instance with a guy named John Scheiban, who created Breaking Bad, which a lot of people, Tom liked the show because it had edge. He thought this guy might lend a little edge to this story, so it's not just a celebration of America and triumphalism, and it's just a tough movie about warfare. And he said, "John, I want you to put together a 300-page Bible. It's the whole story, not the scripts, but they're almost like scripts, so that when we start filming, I can give 1 and 2 to this director, 3 and 4 to that director, 5 and 6 to this director, and they all have read the Bible. They all know what the handoffs are. We can bring in the actors, and we can film this thing very fast," which is what we're going to do. We have a Bible. But the problem was the first Bible, John finished. It was 260 pages. It wasn't too bad. I was in Florida vacationing with my granddaughters. 1 grandfather, 3 granddaughters. All I did is follow them around with a credit card. And but I got a call from Tom at the pool. He said, "Don, the script is shit." I said, "Oh, that's great. Great day." And we're firing John, which he did. And John's a hell of a nice guy. And I had to make the call. And I kind of agreed with Tom that as good as he was, this wasn't up to Tom's standard, because he told us at the beginning, if this isn't the best war movie ever made, I don't want to make it. And Spielberg feels the same way. These guys have a commitment to veracity. They have commitment to truth, to telling things as they actually happened. For example, at one casting meeting, somebody said, well, we're going to get a flight surgeon in this film. And someone says, well, who are we going to do? Well, someone suggested a composite character made up of the characteristics and personal experiences of 3 combat surgeons. Tom said, no composite character. Every character in this film has to be a real, his name is the name of the guy who actually did it. Okay? So we're going to bring that sort of thing to an audience and tell it with a lot of veracity or verisimilitude as well. Verisimilitude in the sense of the feel for the situation, the feel for the war. Movies are about moods, and a lot of the scripts, one of our script writers, John Orloff, wrote a thing, Why We Fight for Band of Brothers. It's the concentration camp scene in Band of Brothers where they discover the camp. There's only 3 pages of script in that. The rest is film and the reactions of the faces of the men. So, and John is so wrapped up in this. I talked to him the other day. He just did the Regensburg-Schweinfurt thing. They wait. 2 missions, one going to Regensburg, one going to Schweinfurt. Weather's bad at both divisions' bases. One group goes ahead, the other group goes behind. It's a terrible mess up. They fight down the bloody chute for 2.5, 3 hours. And he said, for 90 minutes, that's all we're going to do is have these guys fighting in the plane, like I said. And he just has this tremendous, it comes up from the guts, and he's bought into this. Tom Hanks has turned his whole office at Plato. It looks like an 8th Air Force museum. He's got planes hanging from the ceiling, books all over the place, diaries. He came to my house in Easton, Pennsylvania. He said, I brought a couple of notes. 340 pages of notes. Let's go over them. He said, I've been reading your book again and again. He said, I read it 6 times. I'm reading other books and things like that. That's how he and Spielberg, how invested they are in this. And let me just tell you one final story that I know about, because I was involved with Saving Private Ryan. Now, you remember the beach scene in Private Ryan? Okay, landing at Omaha Beach. It's 19 minutes of sheer terror. And now, Spielberg directed that, and Hanks starred it. Okay, so he had nothing to do with... But Matt Damon was one of the stars. I mean, Hanks was Captain Miller. So, and they have to land and then get through all this and then find Private Ryan. They're not happy about that. I mean, if you land on Omaha Beach like my uncle did, you don't want to go find some kid, and you got Germans in front of you, machine guns in front of you. So how do you create a mood like this? Spielberg invites Damon to come over to England where we were filming and puts him up in a 7-star hotel for a week. The rest of the cast, including Hanks, goes into Marine Corps boot training with a Marine Corps, drill sergeant. And they're living on K rations. They're sleeping in the rain and the mud. It's disgusting. It's cold. The 3rd day, Hanks told me they took a vote, and the actors all voted to quit. And they got to Tom, and he raised his hand and said, I'm staying. And they all said, well, we'll stay too. Okay, we'll stay too. So they got back, and then they were introduced to Damon. He comes out, beautiful, perfect Armani suit. Fresh. He's been in this 7-star hotel for 7 days. They hated him. And that was the whole point of the film. They hating to go for Ryan, and things like that. And now we had our mood. And one other thing about getting it just right. There's a lot of gore in that scene, as there will be in some of our scenes. And you don't just want gore for gore's sake, but you want to get it right. And guys have legs blown off on Omaha Beach. And Spielberg says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to use guys who actually don't have legs. And we're going to put plastic legs on them, prosthetics. So when they come off, we're going to hit them with fake fire, and we're going to blow off the plastic legs so you see them sitting there with the real stumps. That's how realistic he tries to be. We spent $60,000 putting together John Adams' watch for the series on John Adams, just to get it absolutely right. Absolutely right. So that's the kind of film we're going to do. And I think, and I hope you enjoy it. But it is taking time, and we're well ahead on the script writing. And when the screening starts, when we start to do the actual filming, when we bring in, Tom calls the actors the Munchkins, Because for some reason, all these Hollywood actors are pretty short, and all thinking, Munchkins in here, okay. And then we start the filming. And the last thing that he does, and I hope we can do this with the veterans, like we did. Veterans were much younger, of course, you're actually, I love it. My students say, someone's old. Well, they're fortunate to be old. The alternative is dead. And I'm amazed at how many guys from the 8th Air Force are not only alive in their 90s, but alive and well. That panel today was fantastic. That should be. Put it on the road, baby. It should go on the road. It was great stuff. It was great stuff. These guys were living the experience. And we have interviewed and filmed. We went to Savannah to the 8th Air Force Museum, the 100th Bomb Group Conference down there, and we interviewed lots of veterans. We have films and things like that, and we're going to use that stuff. But what we're going to do is, if an actor plays a guy and that guy's alive, he's going to be talking, the actor is, to that guy on the phone every day. So that when we were filming the Pacific, R.V. Bergen was one of our characters, and R.V. was Eugene Sledge's, he was the main character, Eugene Sledge's platoon lieutenant. And so every day the actor who played Sledge would call Sledge before scene. How did you do this? How did you act like here? We'd bring Sledge out to the set. We're going to try to do that, pairing up. And if guys aren't alive, we're talking to their families. We're talking to characters' families all the time, almost every day. Tell us more about your father. Tell us more about your husband. So we want to really bring these people to life with again, a lot of veracity. Okay. Now, and HBO's given us the money to do this. Our budget right now is around $375 million, which will make it the most expensive show in the history of television. So if you get an idea of Fury by Brad Pitt, the tank show, that cost $76 million. So it's a big ticket item. That's the map. And you can't see a map very well here, but the important thing is that it's like the Civil War. This is all the Reich, and we got to win it back. And not only do we have to win it back, we got to hold what we won, and that takes, Neptune's trident, Navy, air, ground, and everybody contributing to that sort of thing. And of course, the great disability that the Air Force had in the beginning was the range of the fighters, as you all know. And this map, which I have at the beginning of the book, gives you a sense of, in the beginning, the Spitfires could only get close to the Brittany sub-bases here, which we were bombing regularly, as well as we could, which was not very good in the early part of the war. These were real suicide missions. This is the Memphis Belle period, when very, very few crews survive. Imagine that. They arrive on August 15th, and the first crew to make it through, Hell's Angels, does it in May. What happened to all the crews before that? They're dead. They're dead. And the depression that set in, I talked to Bob Morgan about this. He said, Don, the depression was killing. We had to have London. If London wasn't there, women and booze, he said, I couldn't have made it. I couldn't have made it. So, and then, of course, we eventually get some Thunderbolts that can make it to the German border, and then finally the Mustangs that can go all the way to Prague, with Tokyo tanks. So, again, learning as you go along. In the beginning, of course, no one thought it was technologically possible to build a fighter like the P-51 Mustang. Here we are, the kings of world technology, and all our engineers, including the German engineers, saying this to their own air people. We can't build a fighter plane that can fly long distance, because you've got to load up on the fuel, and at the same time fight dogfights to survive. So be nimble. How do you be nimble and heavy at the same time? You have to be light to be nimble. Well, we did it. We did it. And that plane arrived just in time to save the air war. So there's all these challenges that are to be met. Targets all over the place. All of them, stuck closely together, as the bases in England were stuck closely together. These are the delivering instruments of the war. A lot of people ask, what was the most dangerous spot in the plane? Right there, the pilot. Because kill him, and there could be, again, the co-pilot, and the flight engineer's got to take over. Or the radio guy if they've had some flight training. And so the heaviest casualties by far were here. Also, when the Luftwaffe attacked, originally they came up behind And the tail gunner had a heavy responsibility of holding them off. They came up from below. But you lose a lot of fighter speed when you fight like that. So Adolf Galan, the head of the German Air Force, and by the way, his brave boys in the Luftwaffe, and they were brave boys, they're fighting for their Heimat, their homeland. His guys were afraid of the fortresses. They call them the Boeings. And you interview Luftwaffe pilots, and you get that too. We feared the Boeings. Well, we feared the Focke-Wulfs. We feared the Messerschmitts, and they feared the Boeings. So there's fear on both sides. But the only effective way to hit this plane is to come in on echelon. 6 planes flying wing to wing straight in out here. You see them out here about 2 miles, and 1, 2, 3, 4, they're flying over you. And you just got to hose them with what you have, with your Browning machine guns. And if you hit the front of the plane too, the wings stretch out here. That's where the fuel tanks are. So that's the major danger there. Of course, radio gunner back in here with his radio gun. That was my father's position in the plane. The flight engineer here, he'd pop into that turret. I'm telling this to some people who know it, but there's also a lot of people in this audience, younger people too, who know nothing about the 8th Air Force or little about it. So I presume nothing. Waist gunners here, firing out the sides. Originally, the ports were open. So inside the plane, it could be as freezing, well, as cold as 52 degrees below zero over Berlin in the middle of winter until they closed this thing up, and it was still cold because the plane isn't heated. And way back here is the tail gunner, and his machine gun belt goes all the way back to here, 9 yards, the whole 9 yards. That's where the expression is, you use them all up. And so that's the plane, and it's, as you know, and people who don't know this feel a B-17 sometimes. You could get a very strong guy with a screwdriver can go whack and knock the screwdriver right through the lining of the plane. So imagine what flak can do. So pretty tough stuff. These are the guys who led the 8th Air Force, and they're not so much my topic today. We're going on personalities, and I want to focus on one here, a guy named Robert Rosie Rosenthal, for just 2 seconds. I met Rosie at the 8th Air Force Museum, and the first time I met Paul Tibbets as well. I was more interested in Tibbets at the time because I was doing a book on the Pacific, and I wanted to find out about the 2 atomic raids, a little bit more about it, and I met Rosie there. And he turned out to be my hero, at least. Bob Rosenthal was from Brooklyn. He lived near Ebbets Field, loved the Brooklyn Dodgers. Jewish family, very poor, lots of brothers and sisters. Went to Brooklyn College. Was an All-American. They had a good football team then. He was an All-American football player and an All-American baseball player. He's now in their Athletic Hall of Fame. And he went to law school, graduated at the top of his class, got a job on Wall Street, the dream of every kid at the time, and Pearl Harbor comes. And he signs up on Pearl Harbor Monday. And he goes to war, and he fights, and he flies for 52 missions. He could have got out after 25. Everybody said, Rosie, go home. He said, I'm going to continue to fight, to fly and fight until Hitler lives, until the Nazis are in power. I fly. Not because I'm a Jew. That has nothing to do with it. This man is a threat to civilized values. And that's why I'm going to fly and fight. And he did. And he was shot down 3 times. The last time he was shot down in a firefight over Berlin between at the ground. This is what's going on the ground. The Russian army was engaging the Wehrmacht, the German army. And Rosie landed right between the 2 armies. And he didn't know what the hell to do. He just felt good that he got out of the plane because as he was flying, he spun out of control. All his guys got out of the plane. One guy tragically lost his leg. But Rosie said he felt like he was in quicksand. The forces, the G-forces, were just getting at him and he's coming down. And he said he doesn't remember how, he got out of the hatch. And his chute opened. He doesn't remember that. But he remembers hitting and taking cover. And all of a sudden, some Russian soldiers with a big red star on their hats, the winter caps, are approaching him. And he knows who they are. They don't know who he is. So he said, I got one chance here. He rose up. He kind of erupted out of the ground. And he started yelling, Babe Ruth, lucky strike, New York Yankees, Coca-Cola. They took him back to Russia. He had some vodka. He wasn't a big drinker, and they got him back to the 100th Bomb Group base at Thorpe Abbotts, and he survived the war. He's sitting in his law office when the war's over. He did sign up to go to Pacific and was in training, but that didn't work out, luckily, because of the atomic bombs. It ended the war. Anybody who's against the atomic bomb ought to talk to some of the veterans who were saved by the dropping of the 2 bombs, as horrific as that was. Now, he's sitting in his law office and he's reading about the coming, in August, late August, the coming Nuremberg Trials. They're going to try these Nazis. And he goes over. He volunteers to become a trial lawyer and was a trial lawyer at Nuremberg. On the way over, he meets a very attractive young Navy lawyer who he falls in love with, Phyllis. And they got married in Nuremberg. Rosie said, it happened so quickly, I don't know what happened. I don't know whether I was seasick or in love or what. He said, and when finally they brought the Nazis, the worst of the Nazis, they brought them to their death. They couldn't do it with Goering. Rosie said, I wanted to see, I'm not a man who believes in capital punishment, but I wanted to see Goering hanged. I wanted to actually be there when he was hanged, but he committed suicide. But he did see Keitel and Jodl, and that was his closure. He saw that, and Phyllis investigated German civilians who tortured American airmen. One, they found evidence in the house. They found the skull of an American airman that this guy had cleansed of all hair, polished, and put on his desk, and used it, as a paper holder on his desk. So she prosecuted those cases, and that was his war. So it's characters like that, and he never talked about the war. Hardly ever talked about it until I started to pull this story out. Never wrote about it. His would have been a hell of an autobiography, but because he was a good writer. Anyway, the story of this Air Force is amazing. I mean, it starts, we don't have a bomber force. We have, the 8th Air Force is seven men and no planes in Savannah, Georgia in late January after Pearl Harbor. And of course, the British, they're equipped for this. And let's not, you guys often argue about B-17s versus Liberators. Forget that shit. Forget it. Okay. And this was a cooperative effort. And you should remember, too, that it's only possible with the RAF for the bombing to be truly, massively effective. Okay. And they got hammered, too. 110,000 airmen flew for the RAF, mostly by the end of the war in Lancasters, the biggest plane in the war. 110,000 flew. 55,000 were killed. Okay. Those figures are pretty astonishing. War's not pleasant. 600,000 German Reich citizens in the Reich are killed. The numbers, you never want to trust historians completely with numbers, but those are the numbers that the Nazis kept, and they were pretty good record keepers. 61 German towns turned to rubble and ash. Absolute catastrophe. We're now talking, we used to talk of 50 million dead in World War II. 80 million they're talking about now because the Russian archives are open. 27 million Russians we now count were killed in the war. 23 million Chinese. Go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 5 dead. You go like that for 6 years, guy dies every second in the world. I like to describe World War II this way. Nobody did anything but for the war effort. The whole country stopped in the United States. 90% of American productivity was developed and devoted to warfare. Okay? It was a country that lived inside war, was war. Someone mentioned going home and seeing nothing but women. Yeah. My mother worked in an aircraft factory too, and they did their part as well. My grandfather made the steel, they made the tanks for Patton. Too old to serve in the war. So full out effort. So we weren't used to fighting like this. The only war we'd ever fought like this, and it was equally horrific, was the Civil War. Okay, 4% of Americans who fought in World War II were killed. In the Civil War, the number was 7%. So that's the highest. I like to put this picture up because this looks like my junior varsity football team. They are so young. When I looked at the faces of these guys with their Mae Wests on and things like this, I could hardly find a guy that actually looked 21 in something like this. And yet, I think of a kid that I interviewed who said, Don, he said, in 1943, in January, I was ready to enter the second semester as a history major at Syracuse University. Okay? All right. And move up in time, 6 months later, I was navigating a plane across the Great Northern Route across Greenland to Prestwick, Scotland. And I'd never flown in a plane before I joined the Air Force. That's how quickly These guys are rushed green into combat and have to learn on the job. And this is another reason you guys do what you do now. You depend on your buddies, and your buddies for life. Sometimes the celebrities get in this story. We're not going to tell many celebrity stories, but that's Clark Gable in the middle. But it gives you an indication. Gable actually went over there to do, and he is the star, he always was. This is after Gone with the Wind. And he was married to Carol Lombard. And she kept saying, hey, big guy, she called him big guy, you got to get in the war, even though you're old. He's in his late 30s. And then she was killed. She was killed in an air accident on a bond drive. And he was overwhelmed, just flooded with guilt. And he signed up, and the guys who served with him in England said, this guy wanted to die. This guy was dangerous to fly with. And he wanted the toughest missions. He was over there to do a film called Air Gunner, and it's a great film. And it was designed by the Air Force as a propaganda film to get kids interested in becoming air gunners. But by that time, the film was made, we had enough air gunners in the pipeline, and the film was never shown like Memphis Belle was shown. But interesting guy. Positions in the plane, ball turret. I can't imagine being in a ball turret. And when I interview veterans, a guy will walk in the room, 6'3", he said, I was a ball turret gunner. I go, no way. And I thought, wait a minute, that's the Army. Right, Ben? It's the Army. And there he is, the embryo and the egg, held down like that. No heat in there. How do you vacate? How do you urinate? You can get out. It's pulled up when you take off and land, but you're flying down through the Reich. It's down, and it's a tough position to be in the plane upside down like that. The disorientation is absolutely tremendous. And here's the Memphis Belle crew, the famous picture of them flying after flying off the ground after flying their 25th mission and coming home. Of course, then the missions, as the guys were describing later, as the war gets tougher and the bombing becomes more effective, it has a catch-22. The bombing works better, you got to fly more missions. We're killing the Reich, we got to put it under. And so the missions go up to 25. There were no mission limits originally. They went to 25, then 30, then Doolittle introduces 35, and then he says we're not even going to keep the fighters close to the bombers. A couple guys were remarking that at the panel today. Where were the fighters? They were pretty far off because they're hunting. They're hunting Germans. They're hunting the Luftwaffe. And they're killing the Luftwaffe. And in a 6-month period between December and June running up to D-Day, they killed the Luftwaffe. It was the most savage air battle in the history of warfare. The B-17s did a heck of a lot of the damage, but so did the Thunderbolts and the Mustangs. And the guys on the ground who don't get the credit, they were there the whole time. Ground pounders is a nice little word, but it's a cliche. These guys did some pretty tough duty in England. They're the ones that mostly married the British girls, actually. They met them and married them, and met them in the pubs, perhaps, and things like that. And sometimes there were bomb accidents and bombers exploding, and 2 and 3 of them in the chain reaction and just turning to atoms, 20, 30 human beings. This happened to the 303rd Bomb Group. Now, I teach college, and a lot of times kids don't pay attention because college kids are experts at falling into sleep-like stages with their eyes open. And so these kids paid attention. All right. The intelligence officer gets up there, he pulls back the curtain, and there's that long string to the target. It's going to be a rough day. And you got to listen to everything. On that board, if you can see it closely, are weather conditions, German defenses, the nature of the defenses, weather conditions over England, over the target, how much intelligence has been done on the target, when you're going to drop the bombs, what kind of bombs you're dropping. Then the pilots and navigators have to go with the pilot, navigator, and the bombardier had to go into special sessions as well. And generally, the guys would go out to the planes in the jeeps, the officers in the front of the plane. Mechanics are working with the gunners, and they're out there. Sometimes the gunners slept out on the hard stands with the mechanics the night before a big mission. Sometimes before a mission, a priest or a minister would come out and bless the guys. There would be a mass or something like that. There were no Jewish rabbis. There were no rabbis. Rosenthal, of course, who was Jewish, I asked him, I said, well, what did you do? He said, I went to Catholic Mass and Protestant services. That didn't bother me one bit. Now, this isn't Newark Airport, but these guys are, look at how close they are flying, I mean, we get some clearance at least at a place like Newark or LaGuardia, or LAX or places like that. And this could be the most dangerous part of the mission. And if you're flying in a B-17, especially because of the way it's tilted up, you couldn't see the ground in front of you, so sometimes they'd run off the concrete and have to be pulled out with tractors and things like that. That's where the farmers who lived on the bases would come in handy. Liberators, it was a little better because they're flatter planes and things like that. Here's the navigator. Here's our friend Lou Lovsky. It's not actually Lou, this is a stage photo. But his responsibilities are immense. The pilot's constantly taught, where are we, where are we, where are we? And the kid has to know. And when mistakes were made and guys were killed, the responsibilities did not fall so much on the pilots as they fell on the navigator. He's the guy who got us to the wrong city. He's the guy who got us over the heaviest flak. He's the guy who made the mistake. Remember 12 o'clock high? And the commander in the beginning comes in and makes excuses for the kid, the navigator. The navigator says, I made the mistake. These are the guys that take the heat in a lot of cases. So there's heavy responsibility there. Back to the radio gunner, of course, who has his radio, and then in addition, he has the machine gun at the back of the plane. And a stage shot of a gunner. Now, the big danger in the beginning of the war, a lot of you guys who are younger wouldn't have experienced this as much, was frostbite, because they got this a little bit under control. But it was epidemic at the beginning of the war. I can't tell you how gruesome the photographs are. But I do have the diary of a Navy nurse who tended to one of the patients who was being shipped back from England with severe frostbite. What do I mean by severe frostbite? This guy had lost both his ears, his nose, his mouth, and both his eyes froze shut and had to be pulled out by the surgeon. Okay? And that's frostbite. And most medics on bases, and they're not doctors, you had medics, you had also surgeons. Sometimes they were surgeons, actual surgeons, sometimes not. But severe frostbite, you're sent to an actual hospital. And all doctors could do is what they call the Russian cure. The limbs, the extremities would turn black and then purple, and they would fall off. And then when everything had fallen off, you could operate. And that's about the only way you could really save anything in a situation like that. A lot of times guys took shots themselves with their own cameras, Kodak cameras and things like that. This is a shot of two planes colliding over England. This is how soupy it got when you came in. I mean, it was hard to see the pattern. The pattern is, England is richly green, and the air forces can mingle like that. They're very close together, so sometimes it's really hard to find your base. But imagine finding your base in a mess like this, or taking off in a mess like this. And they'd go up in a spiral pattern, sometimes around a radio beam, and if there was an accident, all you'd hear was the collision itself, and maybe see a fiery ball. So this is dangerous stuff. And of course, at the end of the mission, they count them in. They count them in. And this is where, how do you get these stories? You get them from you guys, but also you get them from actually people who were in England at the time. One of the really neatest experiences I had was going to places, air bases in England, Liberator bases, fortress bases, fighter bases, and talking to people who were there during the war. They were 8, 9, 10, 11 years old. And I go back every year. I was just back in May for a week. I took my grandson with me, 14 years old. He loved it. And they tell these great stories. I'll share one with you. I was talking to a farmer and his wife, and they revere these guys. They revere you guys. It's a shame that some of our organizations in this country, including at Savannah, don't pay enough attention to those bases over there and make stronger connections with them, because these are tenant farmers who, on their own, without any cash, have restored these air towers as museums and built Nissan huts and set up museums inside them and carry on the tradition. When my book was published in England, they changed the title to 8th Air Force. I asked my English publisher why. He said, the 8th Air Force is well known over here, but not in the United States. The title wouldn't ring as effectively in the United States as it would in England. It is so well remembered, thanks to Duxford and places like that. So there's a tradition there. And I was standing there talking to this farmer and his wife, and he said, he's now about 77, 78 years old. And he said, I lived with Mom and Pop. I was 9 years old. And he said, one day there was a knock at the door, and our cottage, this is at Thorpe Abbotts, was right on the base. So Dad answered the door. He was smoking a pipe in the kitchen, talking to Mom, and an airman was there. And his face was all sweaty and red and frostbitten. And he said, yeah. And he said, do you have any hot water? And they said, well, no, but we have some cold water. We can put a pot on for you over the fire and get you some hot water in a couple minutes. And he said, I need a shave. So he went in the dining room, is where they put this pan. They poured the water into the pan, and he started to shave. And then he stuck his head around into the kitchen where Mom and Pop were sitting, and he said, I lied to you. He said, I didn't really need a shave. I needed a family. And he was just homesick. He had a young wife at home, and he had a baby he hadn't seen. And they adopted him. And he'd come in, and about the fourth visit, he said to Father, he said to Glenn, Mr. Glenn, he said, can you take me to the pub? I'd like to meet a girl. So Mr. Glenn took him to the pub. He met a girl, and he fell in love with her. And one day, Mom and Pop and the son were out there, and the boy's plane didn't come back. They were counting him in. They looked for his number, and it didn't come back. And Mom said, I know they're alive. I know they're alive. We'll see those boys again. A month later, they got a letter from a Stalag Luft 3, and it was a Red Cross envelope, and it said, well, 6 of them died, and 4 of us lived, and we still remember your Christmas dinners. And actually, the guy came back after the war to marry that girl, and she had already married because she thought he was dead, and she'd named her child after him. But you can't get stories like that in the archives because these people don't talk about it, and they don't write books. So you got to go to the spot and see these sorts of things. There we go. One final story, and I'll open it up for questions. Two actually. This is an Andy Rooney story. I interviewed Andy, and he was great. He covered the war for Stars and Stripes, and he's the only reporter in Europe who won an air medal and an infantry medal. When after D-Day, he went on the continent, and he was everywhere. And he told me something interesting. He said, I was in London, and I had just graduated from Syracuse University. I was a young kid myself, and I knew some guys at this one base, Alconbury. And he said, I went up there, and I thought it was going to be like a college campus because they're all kids. And they got clean sheets and food and ice cream and pubs and girls. They're not in the grime and grit, of Iwo Jima. And he said, what I saw was, this is after some terrible missions the guys had flown, like a torpor. Everybody's like in a trance. He watched a volleyball game that took place, he said, for over an hour, and nobody said anything. He said, these guys were hurting up here, really stunned. And, one day you go to the Nissan hut and a couple guys are missing. The next day you gather on the softball field, and where's your second baseman, catcher, right fielder, and left fielder? They're dead. And that's the first time you find out about it. So he goes to this base, and while he's there, he is a witness to one of the most tragic things that happened in the air war. A ball turret gunner got caught in the turret, and they shot out all the mechanisms in the turret. They shot out also the hydraulics in the plane, so they couldn't get the wheels down, and they couldn't extract the ball turret gunner from the ball turret. So they have to land on the plane's belly. Now, see, usually they extract this thing into the plane, and he gets out before the landing. So they're going to smash him to death on the airfield. So they got a priest into the control tower. He's an Italian kid, and the priest told him that he was going to die in about 3 minutes, and to hold on. And he gave him the last rites, and he landed, and that's what happened there. And Rendell Jarrell, the Air Force poet, wrote a poem about a similar incident, and he said they washed the body out with a hose. So stories like that, and the grimness of it, too, I think is caught in this picture of these guys. All they want to do is get their 25, 35 done and go home. They're after a mission. They're not happy guys. There's a moment of exultation. You get a donut, a cup of coffee, maybe a shot, a double shot if it's a bad mission. There's a Red Cross girl around, maybe 2 on base. God help those girls. 5,000 guys and 2 girls. I have a friend who's writing We have a diary that someone gave us. A good friend of mine's mother served in the Red Cross on the 100th and 390th Bomb Group, with the 100th and 390th Bomb Group, and we have her diary. I would read it on the bus in our last 2 trips to England, and we're going to use her as a character in the book, in the movie, and it's terrific stuff. This is one thing I wanted to finally talk about, because in our film, I mentioned I have a lot in concentration camps, but in our film, we have 4 major characters. 2 of them are shot down and imprisoned within 6 months of arriving in England. So a lot of this film is going to take place in St. Stalags. And the other characters, like Rosie, fly on. Some guys who crashed and weren't captured were saved, like this guy. Now, Vivian gave me this photograph, and she interviewed the airman, and he is being escorted, we think by the father and the son who are on the right and left, and someone from the resistance, the Belgian resistance, took this picture. We don't know who, but the stunned look on the airman's face. And then he was taken in by either the Brusselmans family, someone like that. Women ran these escape lines. They ran them out of their homes in Belgium and France after the liberation. And one of them was called the Comet Line, run by a woman named Dee Dee. And they'd hire guys, or sometimes they'd go themselves and escort the guys to Paris, to Nazi-occupied Paris, down through Vichy, put them up with Basque guides at the foot of the Pyrenees and take them over the Pyrenees into Spain and hope they could get after that to British Gibraltar and be taken back. And some made it and some didn't. That's how Chuck Yeager got out. I interviewed Chuck. What a trip that was. But I think it was his 5th wife who was at the interview with me, and who wanted like $100,000 for the interview. I said, well, we don't really pay for interviews. And she said, well, we want $100,000. I said, I actually have an interview with him that he did with the Air Force. It's 50 pages long, and I could use that instead. She said, okay, we will take 10. I said, all right, well, I'm desecrating. This is a final thing here. Now, this amplifies, this is a point I really want to hit hard on, because this is where the 8th Air Force is most unappreciated. Now, yes, the Mustangs arrive in December and begin to get in the action heavily in late January and February. And yes, they engage the Luftwaffe, but the bombers here become bait. Imagine, and they sense this. Your mission now, we're going to almost tell, Spaatz told his commanders, tell the boys, before we'd fly diversion raids, no more diversion raids, sending three groups over here, 2 groups over here, and the main group to the target to deflect the German attention. We want them to know we're coming, because we want to draw up the Luftwaffe and kill it with the Mustangs, because they're fast, they're nimble, and they can go far, they have legs. So the purpose of the bomber now is to be bait for the Germans. At the same time, Doolittle tells them, you're going to go 35 missions, guys, not 25. So that's the double whammy there. And but between February and May, when they start to bomb the railroad yards to prevent the Nazis from bringing up reinforcements for the Normandy invasion, they fight this colossal air war, people like Gabby Zabreski and the Thunderbolts, and of course, they kill as many Luftwaffe planes as the Mustangs, and they make possible D-Day. And later on, they start hitting targets like this. I just wanted to show the Jimmy Stewart picture. We got a Stewart thing. By the way, I was in a small English town close to the base where Stewart served, and they have a brewery there. And I took my grandson there for his first English pint. He's 14. And I talked to the old man who started the brewery. His son was giving the tour, and he said, we were in sorry trouble at the beginning of the war until the 8th Air Force arrived and put a base near here. He said Stewart called and said he wanted a truckload of beer. Now in England, a truck is like a little push thing. So that's what they brought. Stewart said, no, a truck. You want a whole truck of beer? Yes. 3 days later, they called for another truck. He said, they saved the Green Brewery. They saved the Green Brewery. But back to that scene. And this is what being bait means. That plane got back. It got back, okay, in these absolutely ferocious raids. Here's a kid, a victim of flak. This is what it did to his helmet, okay, inside the plane. This is what can happen. Vivian was interviewing a guy, Sherman Small, and I was sitting in the room, and Sherman tells us a story. He was in the tail of a B-17, and the tail was blown off, and he dropped to the sky 21,000 feet and lived. And then they sent him up again. And then they had to take him off the plane like a frozen Wisconsin log. And the next step was Don Carlos Hospital for the mentally ill in Florida for 3 years. And Sherman, very successful businessman after that, and a great contributor to the 8th Air Force Museum. You had flak houses where the guys had a chance at least for a week or so after tough missions or if they served, Flight 10 or 12, where you could take your uniform off, the Red Cross girls there, there was archery, there was punting, you could ride horses and things like that, and celebrations and things. But the double point I'm making in conclusion here is that in that fight against the Luftwaffe, if they don't win, if the 8th Air Force and its fighter groups do not win that fight, there is no Normandy landing. I stood with Tom Brokaw and Steve Ambrose years and years ago, both close friends, and we stood over the beaches, and Tom was going to do a show, and I said, Tom, what you want to point out is who wasn't here. The U-boats weren't here. They had been knocked out in August of '43, out of the Central Atlantic and closer in. And the Luftwaffe wasn't here. And the Luftwaffe wasn't here because you guys were there. And yes, they made more planes later. Yes, they pulled more pilots into battle, but they were green pilots who couldn't fly those new planes. And they didn't have the gas to do it because you guys knocked the gas out. But the big thing is the landings take place. Now, they have, at Normandy recently, a monument to my uncle's group, the 1st Division. I mentioned he went in there early on D-Day, and they deserve that monument. It's a beautiful, beautiful Egyptian spire, elliptical thing. And I was saying to the people at the National World War II Museum, because we did the visitor center there, we should start helping to put up a monument on Normandy Beach to the 8th Air Force, near the cemetery at Omaha. Because, let me give you a figure. The Allied airmen suffered 19,000 killed in this run-up to D-Day. Fewer than 5,000 men were killed on D-Day. And that's not factored into the story here. And what else isn't factored in, what hardly anybody knows about, are these final marches. Now here you see Lou Lovsky, the guy I talked about on the right. He is at Moosburg. How did they get to Moosburg? Well, in January of 1945, the Russians begin their final drive toward Berlin across the Vistula. Okay, and word gets out to the commandants at the camp, move the prisoners. Nobody knows exactly why. Some thought Hitler was going to use the airmen as hostages. Okay, some thought he'd go to Berchtesgaden and surround it with airmen so it wouldn't get bombed. A negotiating tool. Whatever the reason, over 35,000 British and American airmen are marched across the Reich. Now, I know about the Bataan Death March. I've written about it. It was horrible. But more men died on this march than died on the Bataan Death March, and that isn't well known. These men marched from January until May through the heart of the Reich while the war was still going, through the very towns they bombed. And that created all kinds of mental and moral dilemmas. You see on the one hand, one airman sitting watching a German woman, an old grandmother, a baba, sitting on top of the ruins of her house and crying. We did that. Next, they see a bunch of people they think are in their pajamas. They're prisoners. Well, no, they're not prisoners. They're a different kind of prisoners. These are the Jews we've heard about, okay? And they smell. You could smell them almost a mile away. They're being rushed to the Eastern Front to build fortifications against the Russians. They pass the American prisoners side by side. And some of the guys yelled out, "Who are they?" And some of the Jewish prisoners fall to the ground and are machine pistoled to death by the Germans. And I talked to Alan Hull. I talked to a couple of guys who were in an incident like that. The horrible sense of not being able to intervene, not being able to stop this, not being able to just rush the guy who's shooting the burp gun, and was awful and immense. But now they saw why we fight when they walked through the Reich. And they were stoned in some towns. They were spat upon. And finally they made it to Moosburg. And they sat there and they waited. And they didn't know anything about the war. That's the distances they went. All the way from East Prussia across to Moosburg, which is just north of Munich. okay? And that's what the place looked like when it was emptied out. But this is what it looked like when it's liberated. And that made it all worthwhile. We won. We beat the savages. Thanks a lot. Yeah, we can do that unless people are tired. Take a couple questions if anybody has a question.
I have a microphone if you'll raise your hand and give me a... Or I can do a Hail Mary and probably kill a couple people in the way.
Hi, my name's Greg Hatton. My father was a POW, and I just wanted to know if you had heard about the Heidi Krug run.
Absolutely. I have it in my book. I have a
terrific
chapter on the Heidi Krug run.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. And I interviewed guys who were on it. Yeah. They were moving prisoners from one camp to another, and when they unloaded them at the final camp at Heidi Krug, the prisoners had to run along this road up to the camp, and the Germans sicked the German shepherds on them on the way up there, and the men were being torn to pieces up there, and the Germans flanked the road with troops so that if men tried to run off into the woods, they were killed by German burp guns. And yeah, that's the Heidi Krug run. So yes, some airmen did not suffer in the camps, but there's another kind of suffering in the camps. Think of Lou Lovsky, the guy he said, all I dreamed about is I'm thinking I'm a Jew and I know what they stand for here. I'm going to someday get torn out of my bed and taken out in the forest and shot. He never was, but the mental torture is unbelievable. And if I go out and rob a 7-Eleven, I know what my prison sentence is going to be. The judge is going to tell me 3 to 5. These guys don't know. The uncertainty is terrifying. You know, that's why the war news is so important. Yeah. No, that's what I said, you know, in my remarks, that we want to, in fact, one of our major characters is Ken Lemons. He's a mechanic, and he stays the entire war, and he's woven right into this whole story, absolutely, and the surgeons and things like that. Yeah, yeah. My wife's uncle served the 8th Air Force the entire war, you know, and as ground personnel. By the way, what they did for ground personnel at the end of the war, they did these trolley missions. They flew them into Cologne and places like that and let them walk around in Cologne and see the damage that had been done. It was a little dangerous, but they allowed them to do that. And over 25,000 guys flew eventually on these trolley missions who had served as ground personnel. Because Spot says they deserve to see this. This is what their work made possible, the winning of the war.
One of the purposes of the 8th Air Force Society is to educate the next generation. My father was a B-24 bomber co-pilot, and he died 17 years ago. My wife and I are here to get re-educated. But really, when you're looking at the next generation, we are not the next generation, nor are my children the next generation. Right. It's the grandchildren of mine and the great-grandchildren of the heroes here. How do you think we're doing, and what's your prognosis for the future of the education of the next generation, which is not me, not my sons, but my grandchildren?
My prognosis is grim. I think what's going to save this are museums, not schools. Because this stuff doesn't get into the curriculum. You got to remember that I teach high school teachers at a seminar in New Orleans every year. We pay for high school teachers to come in from all over the country. We pick 30 really good ones. They come from every age group and everything like that. We do it every year. We're now up to doing 75 students a year. And so I got a good sense of what's going on in the high schools. Then we visit the high schools too. And some teachers at some schools are allowed a lot of latitude, and they can do World War II, for example, in a week. Some are only allowed a half an hour. And some don't do it at all. And there's a great tendency in schools to do the causes of the war and the consequences and not do the war itself. Because people think military history is ugly and awful, you know. Well, actually, I don't want to preach here, but if the 3 greatest moments in American history in terms of shaping this country, right, are the Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II. Okay? Now, what wins independence? Not the Declaration of Independence, which is a piece of paper. What made it reality was beating the British. Okay? Who freed the slaves? Not the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union armies under Ulysses Grant freed the slaves. Okay? A southern plantation owner sitting in Georgia when the Emancipation Proclamation is announced, and it says only slaves in states in active rebellion against the Union will be free. Well, he's not going to free his slaves. The Union Army's nearby. But when Sherman shows up, that's the end of his day. Okay? And same thing in World War II. The Nazis had to be beaten, not with speeches, they had to be beaten with bullets. And so how wars are fought is very, very important. Give you an example, the world I grew up in. Well, I think of, the Russians get pushed back by the German aggression all the way to Stalingrad. They fight back with revengeful fury, and they take Berlin. And they're not going to allow it to happen again. The Iron Curtain is established. The Communist bloc is established. Hungary and all those states go under. Soviets are trying to build a protective zone against Germany. Okay. We win the war with the use of the atomic bombs. The Russians adopt the atomic bomb. What kind of world did I grow up in? A Cold War world where we're hiding under our desks in Catholic schools worrying about the atomic bomb. Your world are shaped by these conflicts. And they have to be dealt with. Okay? ISIS is going to be beaten. I hear Hillary talk. I hear Trump talk. They're both full of crap. None of them has a plan. It's going to be done. It's going to be done with an extension of the way it's done now, cutting off oil supplies, bombing, training the other troops, et cetera, et cetera. These things, so understanding wars is very, very important. We're a world almost shaped by war, and it's not getting taught. It really isn't. And actually, it isn't even getting taught in college. Stephen Ambrose, in his will, donated $1 million actually, to establish a chair of military history at University of Wisconsin. They didn't hire anybody for 24 years. And only with pressure, legal pressure and everything else, did they finally hire someone. Okay? And military history is out at colleges. You know how many jobs in military history there were available, according to the American Historical Association last year in the United States? Two. Okay. So, if you're talking about getting these wars like World War II into the curriculum, or Vietnam, or World War I, I'm not hopeful about that because of what's happening, in where I teach higher education. I have a position as a part military historian at Lafayette College. When I retire, they've already decided they're going to change the position to, something else, feminist studies. Yeah. I'm not happy about it, but that's the way it is.
Who should be?
I have a question over here to your right, sir. Well, actually, I want to wrap a couple things that you mentioned just recently together. You talked about Hungary and the fall of, and the wall and everything else, and then you also were talking about Nuremberg a little bit earlier this week. Of all things, NPR. I heard an interview with the last surviving prosecutor from the Nuremberg Trials. And it was a very interesting story. On the other item about teaching children, the 392nd has somebody who does that in England, John Gilbert. John, would you stand up, please? I've seen some of your presentation paperwork. He teaches the young children every year. And it's invited up to the Sandringham grounds to present each year. It's the volunteers like that are helping keep this alive.
Well,
Thank you.
Just to amplify that, the best moment, except for when I brought Tom Hanks into class, the best moment I always have is when I bring the veterans in. Kids can't get enough of them, college kids. And usually the class is over and they're scurrying out to do whatever they have to do. They stay. They would stay as long as the veterans stayed. It's the highlight. When I have these teacher seminars in New Orleans, we do a seminar run entirely by the veterans. Tom Hanks and I just did a film, an HBO film called He Has Seen War. It's about the very difficult transition that a lot of you guys went through from being trained as a warrior and fighting as a warrior back to civilian life. And that story isn't told enough. It was a great film to do because even when guys passed away, their daughters especially were terrifically interesting to talk to. I'll just tell you one thing. There's a character in the Pacific named Bob Leckie, and Bob wrote a great book called Helmet for My Pillow. In fact, he wrote 41 books. And Bob had very bad post-traumatic stress disorder when he died. He would sit out by the pond in his backyard in Morristown, and the wind would come up, and then the leaves in the frog pond would move, and he said the Japanese are coming. Well, his daughter didn't know why he was like that. She would ask him and say, she'd ask him, say, Dad, tell me about World War II. He said, all I have to tell you is I won World War II. And that's all he'd say to her. And then she said in our interview with her, she said, he was in the Pacific, and I didn't know there was a Pacific War. I just thought it was all in Europe. I never read his book. And all I can do now is grieve and cry about it, because now I know what he was suffering from and why. So connecting, getting oral histories, interviewing people in your family, keeping records, pulling stories out of reluctant veterans in an amicable way. These things are so important. The climate, the cultural climate will change. It always does, and it'll come back strong. As I said, in the museum world, World War II is booming. We're getting 16,500 people a week at the World War II Museum. Okay? That's a lot of people. Okay? It's the largest cultural attraction, the most attended cultural attraction, including the casinos in New Orleans. Okay? And the Smithsonian's doing very well. Kids love the museum experiences, and just take your kids to museums, and then the kids go back and they take these ideas into the classroom. I took my grandkids, all 6 of them, down to the World War II Museum, and they just badgered their teachers after that. We need to learn this stuff. That's the way to do it. But groups like this, really encouraging. Everyone said to me 15 years ago, these veterans groups, these reunion groups are going to pass away because the veterans are passing away, unfortunately. And there's attrition here. You know, they're larger than ever. And there's more young people here than ever. Because the families are tying into this stuff. They're tying into it. And it's great. Thank you.
Dr. Miller?